Well, hello and welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. We are so glad that you have been able to join us today as we seek to hear from a wide range of global and Australian leaders when it comes to multiplication and church planting. The heart of Exponential, right across the church, is to see many more churches planted in our nation in order to reach more people with the good news of Jesus Christ. So it is our great delight that you have joined us today. And today we are joined by a phenomenal leader by the name of Brent Dolfo. Brent may or may not be known to many, but he is a coach and a consultant of denominations and churches all around the globe, passionate about setting strategy and goals when it comes to church planting. Brent hails from Vancouver, Canada, and we are so delighted that you would join us today.
Glad to be with you, Charlie. Thanks for having me.
So fantastic. Well, hey, how about just as we get started, Brent, for those who haven't heard your name or know some of your ministry background and expertise, I wonder if you just give us a bit of a sketch as to why we're having this conversation, your involvement with church planting, and then we'll lead on from there.
Thanks, Charlie. I came to faith going into my final year of high school. And as I went to university, I got involved with the sports ministry of Cru, which is a student ministry on the campuses all around the world. And from my early discipleship with them, they baked into me the idea of multiplication. I remember as a young believer reading Robert Coleman's book, The Master Plan of Evangelism, which did the analysis of Jesus' ministry, to see that while he did spend an extraordinary amount of time with the masses, he primarily spent time discipling and multiplying himself into the lives of 12 people that became the future church planters and leaders of the church. And so that was baked in my DNA from the very beginning. And I remember as I began working with Cru, I was involved in a church plant in our university, that little church that's still active today. And I remember my wife and I having a vision to want to work with college athletes, university athletes. And so we began to plant chapters of Athletes in Action all across the country. We created 13 different chapters across the country where we multiplied our leaders that we were then sent out to begin to reach more people in new locations. So this idea of multiplication is part of my DNA from the very beginning as a believer. And through the years, as I've done coaching and consulting with organizations and movements and churches, this idea of multiplication has been really, really central to kind of what I do. And one of the fun projects I worked with was in Europe, which was the European Church Planting Network. And we identified 30 of the top indigenous church planting movements in Europe and put them together in 2 learning communities over 5 years. And the idea there was to learn from one another's models to accelerate church planting in Europe. And there were everyone from house churches to missional community models to bricks and mortar planters, and in all places from the Ukraine to Belarus to Germany to the UK. And we saw, literally hundreds and hundreds of new churches start, not because I did anything, but we just got in the room to learn from one another so we could accelerate planting over Europe and actually have a dream. One of the interesting things that in that project that I thought was really critical, Charlie, that might be interesting to your listeners is what most galvanized the Europeans towards planting was reading the book of Acts. And at one point, our speaker said, God created a church planting movement in Europe in the first century. If God could do that then, do you think God can do that now? And people really getting a compelling dream that it was possible by faith. And we had groups in there like Holy Trinity Brompton in London, where the Alpha Course comes out of. And that time they were planting a church probably every 3 years. And they really got on board with church planting. And again, nothing to do with me, but the Spirit of God moving. I was with them recently, and last year they planted 41 new churches in their network.
Wow.
And just to see so many different people accelerating their planting, it gives, I think, everybody around the globe hope that if the British can do it, we know the Aussies can do it.
I know that Bishop Rick Thorpe has definitely said if it can happen in the Church of England in the UK, then it can happen anywhere. And so that's a great source of encouragement. And I love that line that you use, that God has done it before, he can do it again. And that is definitely our heart here in Australia. As you speak of your experiences, Brent, and of course you're very humble, you're very much like the Australians as a Canadian, like we're self-effacing. You have been very instrumental in coaching and consulting all around the globe. And I want to kind of jump particularly to that comment that you made about the European church planting, kind of that learning community that happened and has been able to catalyze multiplication. You have been at the genesis and at the source of a lot of these kinds of conversations. And of course, you mentioned multiplication. But I wonder if you could speak particularly as a coach and consultant to the importance of accountability and goal setting when it comes to church planting. They seem to be pretty clear convictions and values to which you work from. And I wonder if you could kind of speak to that for a moment.
Yeah. I think anytime you're doing something transformational, goals and strategies and accountability are really important. But I think there's two other things you have to think about in that conversation. And the first is a compelling dream. The Great Commission, Jesus gave his disciples and his leaders a compelling dream. And I think numbers, while they're important and plans are really important, what really captures people's heart is this compelling dream. And so I think as leaders, we need to be able to articulate a dream that catalyzes us towards action. I'm going to tell you a funny story from the tribe that you come from. I was with Dave Ferguson one time, and Dave was telling us about his monthly leaders gatherings that he has, that he envisions his leaders. They celebrate together. They talk about the future. And he was driving home with his wife that night in the car. And she said, "That was really good tonight." And so Dave said, well, why was it so good? Was I funny? Did you like my talk? What was it? And she said, "It was just really great to hear the dream again, because sometimes I forget it." And there's the wife of a leading church planter and someone who had planted the church with him. And so it's a good reminder that a compelling dream, we need to keep signing up for that compelling dream. The second thing I think we need to think about is this idea of our church culture. And sometimes what we do is, I talk about culture is created by what you reward and what you tolerate. So people emulate the things that you elevate and you reward and you champion. And also they really find out what is true by the things you tolerate. And so sometimes if you want to be a multiplying organization, you have to have a culture that's the highest thing we honor and reward and call out. And yet it's the thing, if we don't multiply, that's the thing that gets you in trouble around here, is not multiplying yourself. So I think we have to think about, do we have a compelling dream? Does our culture, is it a multiplication culture? And then we create systems and processes by which that's lived out. And that really comes down into what you talked about, is having some goals and having a little bit of a strategy and plan of how we're going to activate towards those goals. But I've seen a lot of people get into trouble with starting with goals and never addressing, do we actually have a multiplication culture? So you feel free to noodle off that a little bit if you'd like.
No, I really like that, Brent. And I guess what comes to my mind is sometimes in churches we can fall into a malaise. We can kind of, I think particularly with what we've all experienced in the last couple of years with the pandemic, I think the great revelation, even for us here in Australia, as we have kind of been able to work out that we have this 2% multiplication challenge in Australia, that 2% of the Australian church is multiplying. And of course, I'm sure no one set out for that to happen. That probably crept into our systems, or, of course, Exponential is model neutral. But as we're seeking to see that 2% number increase, there's this sense in which maybe we're falling asleep on some of those numbers. Maybe we're falling asleep on, and so the compelling dream and vision for the future, and yet also being acutely aware of what is the present and how we can move towards that future.
Yeah. I think one of the things that when I've worked with churches and movements on the area of multiplication, there's a couple things that I have observed. When you talk about multiplication and you talk about a compelling dream and you talk about multiplication, there's probably 20 to 25% of staff that go, "I'm in." And there's 75% of staff that kind of give you, "That was a great talk, and now I'm going to go back and do my job." And so I think when you're trying to change a culture of a place, you have to win the battle on 3 levels. The first level you have to win it is the theological level. And I think sometimes we miss this. So that when we do, as I talked about as an early believer, studying Robert Coleman's book, The Master Plan of Evangelism, and looking at Jesus's, commitment to multiply and build multiplying disciples. And we have to look at, 2 Timothy 2:2. We have to think about what I've heard from Paul say, what you've heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, and trust to faithful people who will be able to teach others also. I think of the Great Commission when I often ask, who was the Great Commission given to? Well, it was actually given to the leaders of the church. And Jesus said, basically, what I have done in your life, now go do in other people's lives. He led them to faith. He spiritually formed them. He trained them how to have a ministry. He released them to have a ministry. And his expectation was, if you come follow me, I'm going to make you a multiplying person. And so theologically, we have to ask ourselves sometimes as church staff, have I actually drunk the Kool-Aid and believed that the Great Commission was given to me? The call to multiply in my life is a biblical imperative, and I have to come to grips with that. Am I going to embrace that? So I have to win the battle theologically that multiplication was the normative behavior expected by Jesus. The second thing that we have to win the battle on is what I would call the emotional objections. The emotional objections sometimes sound like this. That's great for you, but I'm not that kind of person. Like I'm not that talented. I'm not that gifted. I'm really quite busy. I got all this stuff to do. In fact, I like leading my ministry where I don't have to raise anyone up. I can do it all. It's really comfortable for me. And so we really have to engage with our teams to say, what is keeping you from embracing the biblical call to multiplication? What are your objectives? And really have some really good heart-to-heart talks. Often, when someone works in finance or administration or the building, they would say, well, that's not me. I just do the numbers. And I also often say to them, well, there's no asterisk at the end of the Great Commission to a church staff person that says, if you're in finance, this does not apply to you. So now I have to engage with how am I going to do that rather than I get an out because I'm working in finance. Some of that, there's a great church in Atlanta that I did some work with, and one of the greatest guys on multiplication on their staff was the production guy. He bought the idea that it was his job to multiply. And I remember in his church, how it was a larger church, and so they were doing filming for the online service and for the screens. And so, you kind of have one chair and you got the guy on the camera. Well, he changed that. He put 2 chairs at every location. And the job of that camera operator was to have an apprentice leader sitting beside him, learning how to do the camera right with him. On the sound booth, there was a second seat beside the guy who was being apprenticed to learn how to be a sound guy. And so, again, you have to win the battle theologically. You have to win it emotionally, but then you have to win it practically. Like, I just don't know what to do. Can you tell me, how would I start? What would I do? And there are loads and loads of people in our pews that would go, I could buy into that dream of multiplication, but I don't know what to do. And so just continuing to tell them they need to do something without helping train them and equip them to do it makes it almost impossible for multiplication to happen. And so if you're trying to create a culture of multiplication, win the battle theologically with your people, win your battle emotionally and deal with the emotional objections, and then give them some how-tos and tracks on how they can begin to multiply themselves.
Oh, Brent, that is so helpful, particularly to kind of think of those multiple layers that kind of apply to wanting to ignite a culture of multiplication in our church. And I guess what then comes to my mind as you're talking about those things, you just alluded to at the end there, this idea of multiplying on every level. Like if a production, stage manager can do that, then I think one of the great challenges for setting out to plant churches, and particularly here in Australia, as we want to see many more churches planted in our time, is we talk about planting churches, but then we realize that we need leaders. And then we realize that if we're going to raise up and send out church planters, then that's going to leave vacancies within the sending church or whatever it may be. And I think one of the things that I've heard you talk about before that was really fascinating was this idea of if we're going to plant churches, we're going to have to multiply on every level. That's not just a church planting challenge. It's also a local church challenge, a leadership challenge. I wonder if you could kind of shed some light on that.
Yeah. So here's where you get real practical. So if you would imagine our church has decided we're going to plant in 2 years and we're going to plant in this location, and we're working to get a planting team together. What I always recommend to churches is then take that back to all your teams and say, what are we going to need if we start a new location? What production will we need? How many worship leaders will we need? How many small group leaders will we need? How many children's people will we need? And then so everybody begins to contribute to the development of that plan. And so that now I'm the children's pastor. My goal or my vision is to do an amazing job to see kids come to faith and grow in our church and raise up the number of church people we need to go plant in the new location with church. And so you've got to get everybody feeling like I have a piece of the pie that makes this going to work for our plant. And so I always call it, can you get your staff to embrace the and? Do your job, lead it great. And can you raise up this many people that we're going to need to plant? So if I'm the worship leader, I know I've got to raise up 4 new worship leaders to go with this plant in the next 2 years. And so then as I'm meeting with the person that I'm responsible to, they're going to be asking me, like, who are the 4? Like, where are they at in the process? Have you envisioned them? What's your process of getting them all ready? And so again, sometimes there's this gap between we want to do this, but yet the rest of the organization hasn't bought into the multiplication and they just do business as usual. And then we get the planting team going, but now they've got to find everybody that will do all that. That needs to be all of us together. We need to own the idea that there's a church plant coming. We have to own that we're going to multiply. And so oftentimes it's easier for a church plant to multiply than it is for an older traditional church to actually change its culture. So it's a multiplying culture. And oftentimes, I really do think that when people put up their hands as a senior pastor and say, I'd love our church to multiply, they really do need a roadmap of how do I go and create a culture and a systems and processes that will allow us to do that. Because they've never learned that in seminary. They've never learned that in their church experience up to this point. And so they really do need some help saying, how do I go from A to B? Because I'm probably not going to do it well without some help. Or what I do is call it, I'm going to have to pay the stupid tax many times over. But if I just spent time with you, Charlie, you could help me not make the mistakes others have made and move more quickly into a multiplying model.
Oh, that's so good, Brent. And I love that line. And I think you could put it on a bumper sticker. How do you help staff, beg my pardon, embrace the and, like the and of what you are doing? And further to that, I think it adds significance to, particularly whether it be with Exponential or other great church planting organizations in Australia. I think many of us have the articulated vision and heart to multiply, and yet the process of getting from A to B is the real challenge. And so whether that be learning communities to involve yourself in that can help map that out for leadership teams, for churches, is a really significant step in that kind of piece of the journey.
Yeah, and I think it takes a real humility under senior church leaders sometimes to go, I'm good at a lot of things, but this thing, I suck at. I have no idea. And there are really, in Australia, you guys have done a great job. There are really great church planting churches. They're really in places, if you want to find them, you can find them. And to come in a humble spirit to say, like, we want to be where you're going to be, but if I kind of just learn on my own, it's going to take me 3 times as long as if you would spend time with me and help me map out how I can go from A to B.
So true. Brent, you've been already so invaluable to kind of be with us today and share some of your gleaned insights. And I love that line that you use often, and you just used it before, of how can we not pay the stupid tax? And that's something that really, as the church in Australia realizes the great need to plant many more churches to reach the many people who aren't within the Church of Jesus Christ in Australia, that we actually need to learn from one another. And there's this sense of collaboration. Of course, we have our distinctives and we're different theologically and pragmatically in a whole range of things, but how can we learn from one another? And I guess the final question I wanted to ask you today was, you've often used this line, which I recognize is borrowed from Bob Buford, who would say that I want to see my fruit grow on other people's trees, which is like a bold, audacious kind of multiplication orientated question. And you know the church in Australia quite well. You've been to Australia several times. You've coached and consulted here in Australia. You've worked widely with organisations and denominational leaders and church leaders. I wonder if you just share for a moment, just take a moment to encourage us as the Aussie church and I guess increased opportunities and incentives towards multiplication and church planting here in Australia. What would you offer us as Australian church leaders in this time?
Yeah. Well, the state of the culture in Australia is not a lot different than Canada. The way that I describe it is we're no longer the home team. We're the visiting team. And when you're a visiting team in a sporting match, there's a lot of people very unhappy if you do something well. And there are lots of people trying to cut the legs out from you and make sure you don't win. And I think sometimes when you are the visiting team, you don't like the hostile environment, the spiritual battle, the challenge. It's a lot easier to live within the walls of your church and just do church and kind of keep your head down. In Canada, we have two kind of narratives that are going on right now in the church. The first one coming out of COVID is, we've got the same issues on gender identity. We've got the same issues that you do on, lots of the cultural wars that are going on. And so one of the narratives is the culture is really not interested in faith. We just got to hunker down, hope for the best, and see how long we can wait this thing out. And hopefully Jesus comes soon because it's getting bad out there. I mean, that's one of the narratives. The other narrative is God is at work and there's going to be some amazing opportunities. And I just want to tell you a few stories that are from Canada. A couple of the churches that I interact with regularly run Alpha. And for those of you who listen, I'm sure most of you are familiar with Alpha or have run Alpha. But I had a number of churches come to me this year and say, the size of our Alpha course this year is double the size that it was before the pandemic. And we didn't do anything else differently than we did before. And we're just seeing this whole lot of people, when they invite their friends to come to Alpha, are saying yes. And, we've got double the size. I was with a friend of mine in another church in Vancouver, and the pastor said to my friend, "You see that guy over there?" And she said, "Yeah." He said, "This is his third week in church." And my friend said, "Tell me more." He said, "Well, Jesus appeared to him in a dream and told him he needed to buy a Bible and he needed to go to church. And so there he is." And so the first week he came, and he basically led himself to faith, and he's in our church. And guess what? He's a white guy in his 20s. He's not a Muslim. We have another guy who's a friend of my son's, and during COVID, he just began to have all this questions in his life. He'd never been involved with church. He went on Amazon and bought himself a Bible and began reading his Bible. And he started in Genesis, because don't you start at the beginning of a book? You don't start halfway through. And so he reached out to my son one day, who is a believer, and said, "I want to know more about God. Can you help me?" And he's come to faith. He was just recently baptized. And again, a white guy in his 20s. And my son just showed me a text from his girlfriend that he sent to him the other day. And she said, "I've just seen your life change. I don't want to offend you. Are you okay to tell me about your faith?" And so in all these stories, all I have to say is the Holy Spirit is still at work. This is the other narrative. God is wanting to draw people to himself. These stories that I told you are people that didn't grow up in the church. God has somehow started through his Holy Spirit working on them apart from a known believer or a church. And so I think we really have a choice to make. Which narrative do we want to buy into? Do we want to buy into the narrative that the culture says, just be quiet, stay in your box, don't bother us, don't impose yourself on us, we'll tell you how you should think? Or do we actually believe the Holy Spirit is alive and active and changing lives and moving like never before? And I'm going to choose to believe the second narrative because I see it happening around me every day. And I think that's one of the big challenges for the church in the Western world. Are we going to believe God is still working? His Holy Spirit is still wanting to draw people to himself. Maybe it's tougher. Now I'm the visiting team, and there's a little bit more of price to be paid when you're the visiting team. But let's not buy into the narrative that God is not working and no one's interested.
So good, Brent. And I feel like the things that you've just described there, really sometimes as the church, we can be looking for the next silver bullet or the next thing that's going to solve my problems, rather than the basic principles that Jesus has given us, in making disciples, the Holy Spirit being at work, and the church being gathered on mission together to be able to multiply and reach as many people as possible. So, Brent, we just want to thank you so much.
Jesus never told us that we were to usher in the kingdom. We're not ushering the kingdom. He's ushering in the kingdom.
Yeah.
And we just get to be about what he's ushering in. So blessings on you and the church in Australia. And Charlie, thanks for our time together.
No, thank you so much, Brent. We so appreciate it. Look forward to connecting with you soon.